The air in the sauna was thick and humid, a warm mist enveloping the wooden walls and creating an intimate atmosphere. The gentle hiss of water meeting the hot stones added a soothing rhythm to the otherwise tranquil room. In one corner, a woman sat against the warm wooden slats, her eyes closed as she relaxed into her comfort zone. She was in her early 40s, a sheen of sweat glistening on her skin. Earlier, her stepson had joined her, sitting across from her, both wrapped in towels. Despite the familiarity of their previous encounters, the enclosed space infused the air with a charged tension neither could ignore. He hadn't spoken since entering, sensing the unspoken weight that lingered between them. His gaze flickered to her occasionally, rhythmically rising and falling as she breathed deeply, beads of sweat tracing along her collarbone. Breaking the silence, her soft voice held a playful edge as she opened her eyes and met his gaze. A slight smile played on her lips. "Yeah, it's just hot in here," he replied, shifting uncomfortably. She chuckled softly, leaning back, causing her towel to slip slightly and reveal more of her shoulder. "That's the point of a sauna," she teased, and his heart quickened as he felt the warmth from her closeness. He quickly averted his eyes, trying to focus on anything but the palpable tension between them, where the heat seemed to intensify both from the steam and their unspoken connection. "You've been quiet today," she remarked gently, her tone coaxing. He hesitated, unsure of how to share his thoughts without revealing too much. Running a hand through his damp hair, he replied, "Just thinking. You can talk to me. We've always been able to talk, right?" she encouraged. He nodded, though she couldn't see the gesture. Their silence stretched, filled only by the sound of steam swirling around them. Just as he was about to shift the conversation, she leaned forward again, her towel slipping just a bit more. "Maybe it's just the heat," she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. "But it feels different in here, doesn't it?" "Yeah, it does," he replied, meeting her gaze for the first time. A knowing smile slowly spread across her face as if she sensed the depth of his thoughts. "Come sit next to me," she said softly, patting the space beside her on the bench. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the heavy air around them, then stood and crossed the short distance, sitting close enough that their legs nearly touched. The heat from her skin mingled with the steam, creating an electric atmosphere. She smiled slowly, as if she were aware of his thoughts. "Come sit next to me," she offered, patting the space beside her on the bench. He hesitated, then crossed the short distance between them, sitting close enough that their legs nearly touched. The warmth from her skin ignited a quickening pulse within him. Neither spoke at first. She tilted her head back, exposing her neck, and let out a soft sigh. "I think about how much you've grown," she murmured. "You're not that kid anymore." Her words left him momentarily speechless, not from the heat around them, but from the weight of her observation. "I'm always here for you," he replied quietly, his eyes intent on her, grappling with the emotions swirling within. "I always will be." Her soft reply carried the weight of promise, stretching the silence into something tangible, an unspoken understanding shared between them. "I should probably go," he said abruptly, though he remained still, a conflict brewing within him. She turned her gaze to him, her eyes momentarily drifting downward. "Or you could stay," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the hum of the sauna, yet unmistakably clear. His breath caught. He felt pulled in two directions, everything in him urged him to remain. The atmosphere was charged, a magnetic pull drawing them closer despite the hesitation. She brushed her fingers against his hand, the gentle contact sending a jolt through him. "It's okay," she reassured softly. "This feels different," he said, the admission slipping out in a near whisper. "It does," she confirmed, her hand lingering on his, her thumb softly gliding across his skin. The closeness, the heat, their faces inches apart, the intensity was overwhelming. Without thinking, he leaned in, their foreheads touching. In that suspended moment, she leaned into him, her breath warm against his lips, neither acknowledging the steam that hissed around them, only the diminishing space between. Her hand slid deliberately up his arm, resting on his chest, sending sensations racing through him. Time felt like it stood still as he tried to form words but failed, lost in the depths of her gaze. Then, she whispered, a feather-light kiss brushed against his lips, a fragile contact that reverberated deep within him. It was a moment suspended between apprehension and desire, the heat of the sauna mingling with the heat between them. The tension was palpable, each lingering touch a step closer to an unspoken boundary. He hesitated, torn between retreating or surrendering, but his body knew what it wanted. As the kiss deepened, the world around them faded. All that mattered was the bond sealing them together, a fragile yet powerful connection that pushed the limits of their affection. His body reacted first, though only by a hair. She looked at him, silently seeking permission to continue. He swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. "We shouldn't be doing this," he whispered, his voice low and husky. Yet his body betrayed him. He leaned in closer, drawn by an undeniable magnetism. Their eyes met, and without a word, they kissed. He placed his hand gently on her waist, pulling her nearer as their breaths quickened. Gradually the kisses deepened, a rhythm building between them. Despite the nagging sense of guilt, he couldn't pull away. Instead, he found himself moving closer. Her lips parted slightly, as if she was trying to express something, but her breath came in frantic gasps, fingers tracing along his neck and through his hair. As the steam swirled around them, she whispered something barely audible, her voice fading as though she couldn't find the right words. Still, she leaned in, pressing her lips to his again, this time with more intent. It wasn't a hurried clash, but a slow, measured exploration of what lay unspoken between them. He instinctively responded, his hand finding her waist, the warmth of her skin igniting a fire within him. The kiss grew deeper, their breaths mingling in the humid air, which heightened every sensation. The towel that had barely clung to her slipped lower, exposing her fully, and he felt her body arch beneath his touch. As his hands roamed her sides, she tilted her head back, surrendering to his kisses along her neck, shivers rippling through her with every contact. "Are you sure about this?" he murmured, his voice thick with desire yet tinged with hesitation. She pulled back slightly, meeting his gaze head on. "I've never been more sure of anything," she whispered, and before he could respond, she kissed him again, fiercely, with an urgency that stoked the flames between them. His hands found the knot of her towel, tugging gently until it slipped away, leaving her completely exposed. She gasped, but rather than retreat, she pressed closer, her confidence radiating from her. He was captivated, his breath catching as his hands explored the softness of her bare skin, and they resumed kissing with renewed fervor, each movement deliberate and slow, as if time itself had ceased to exist. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. She smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes that made his heart race even faster. "You always say the right thing," she teased lightly, though the seriousness in her gaze was evident. They held each other for a moment, their foreheads resting together, breaths mingling in the heated air of the sauna. The sauna was quiet, save for the gentle hiss of steam and the rhythmic beating of their hearts. As she shifted slightly, her leg brushed against his, prompting a playful nudge that drew him closer. Their bodies pressed against each other, the warmth of the wooden walls enveloping them. Her towel, barely hanging on, slipped further down, leaving her exposed, a vulnerability that only seemed to embolden her. She leaned back against the soothing warmth and tugged him with her. Her fingers found the knot of his towel, and with a swift gesture, it unraveled and fell away. He gasped, his heart racing as their skin met, the heat of the sauna intensifying the moment. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and desire, drawing them into a dizzying stillness where words failed. Their eyes locked, each struggling to comprehend the shift in their relationship. Her hands roamed across his chest and arms, her touch light yet electrifying. He responded, tracing the curve of her back with his fingers, feeling as if he were losing control. The simmering desire between them finally boiled over. She pressed her lips to his neck, sending shivers through him as her warm breath danced along his skin. His grip tightened on her hips, pulling her closer, feeling as though they were merging into one. "Are you okay?" she whispered. "Is this okay?" He nodded, barely able to articulate his thoughts. With a soft smile, she leaned in for another kiss, deeper, more urgent. They sank onto the bench, their bodies moving instinctively, every kiss drawing them nearer. The heat intensified, turning each touch into an exploration of longing as they lost track of time. The world outside faded, leaving just the two of them wrapped in a cocoon of warmth and silence. After what felt like hours of bliss, they finally slowed, both exhausted yet satisfied. She rested her head on his chest, their legs tangled together on the bench. As the afterglow washed over them, he wrapped his arms around her, savoring the peaceful silence of the sauna. Words trembled on his lips, but ultimately he said nothing. They lingered in that comforting quiet, understanding each other without the need for speech. Eventually, she sat up and reached for her towel. "We should probably get out of here before we pass out from the heat," she said, laughter lightening her voice. He smiled in agreement, both of them still soaking in the intimate connection that had blossomed between them. They dressed silently, the atmosphere filled with an unspoken acknowledgement that their relationship had shifted. As they stepped out of the sauna into the cool air, he glanced at her, unsure of what to say next. But she met his gaze with warmth and clarity. "We'll figure it out," she said simply, her voice soothing as if reading his mind, and in that moment he knew they would.